Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. As you can tell, I probably have the flu or something, but the good thing about technology, nobody's going to catch my germs. So I feel well enough to get up this morning, and it's a beautiful day. Put on a little bit of a sweatshirt. I don't know if I really needed it because of the weather or maybe because I'm just not feeling so great, but it's about 58, maybe 60. This is wonderful to me, and the sky's blue and sun's out, so it's a great day. And trust that you're waking up feeling refreshed and ready to begin a new day. Today is Monday, August 18th. Can't believe that it's already the middle of August. There are a number of teachers in our family, and they're getting ready to go back to school next week. So it's can't believe the summer has already flown by. We are in the midst of a study called Show and Tell, and I thought we would do something a little different this week. The passage that I'd like to look at is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and I entitled it Spirit-Led or Worldly. And there's a number of themes that will take place throughout this passage. And what I'd like to do is just give you an overview of where we're going to go this week, and then I'd like to break it down as we go through this passage today. My hope is that by the end of the week, we'd have a greater appreciation for how God views his church, how God views leadership. But let me begin by setting a little bit of a context for you. When we look through this passage, one of the things that I want to bring to your attention is there is this in 1 Corinthians 3, if you look back, I'm going to read the first 9 verses for you, okay? And as I read them, I want to make some references back to John chapter 4, where we have begun this whole study of show and tell with the Samaritan woman. So verse 1 starts off this way. It says, "Brothers, I do not address you as spiritual, but as worldly, mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, for you are not yet ready for it. Indeed, you're still not ready. You're still worldly. For since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, are you not worldly? Are you not acting like mere men? For when one says, I follow Paul, or another, I follow Apollos, are you not mere men? What, after all, is Apollos? And what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. The man who plants and the man who waters have one purpose, and each will be rewarded according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building." Let me take a pause here. Do you remember that passage in John chapter 4, where Jesus had been speaking to the Samaritan woman, and she had come to recognize that Jesus was the promised Messiah? Then the disciples showed up, and Jesus turned his attention from the Samaritan woman, and now he paid attention to the disciples, because the disciples were, evidencing a behavior that really showed a complete disregard for the woman. When they came, if you remember the story, they saw Jesus talking to the woman, and they began to say amongst themselves, like, why is Jesus talking to her? And what is it? What is she doing here, basically? And the woman, no doubt, sensed that. Doesn't take a person, if you have any kind of emotional intelligence, right? You walk into a room, it doesn't take you very long to recognize whether you're, welcomed or not. And so she was fine talking with Jesus. But when the disciples showed up, it was a different story. So she leaves. But when she leaves, she goes into the town and tells all of her friends about her conversation with Jesus. And she ends the conversation with them saying, could this be the Messiah that was promised? Well, at that juncture, the friends and everybody start coming back to see Jesus. Jesus, meanwhile, has been telling his disciples that he has come to do his Father's will and to complete his task. That he has eaten of this food, and the disciples are looking at him a little baffled, like, "What are you talking about? You've already eaten." And Jesus is basically saying, "Listen, this work that I'm doing, this is feeding my soul." And then he says to them, "You have heard it said, 4 more months and then the harvest." Now the question is one in which he's saying to them, the harvest is not really yet, right? It's like me saying to you, in about 4 or 5 months, you better get your snow blowers out. Why? Because if you've lived here in New England, we're going to get snow. And Farmer's Almanac is saying we're probably going to get some pretty good amount of snow this summer. I mean, this winter. So when Jesus says 4 more months and then the harvest, he's not saying that the harvest is present. He's saying people will understand that it'll be harvest time in about 4 months. And then he adds, but look, for the fields are ripe unto harvest. And what he's talking about is not grain. He's talking about the people from the town that were coming back. They are the harvest field. And then Jesus says pointedly to his disciples, he says, I sent you out to reap a harvest that you have not sown. Others have gone before you. They have sown, and now you are going to reap, right? The point here is that God's work of building his kingdom is something that has been ongoing since the beginning, since the fall in Genesis. You and I both know now, right, that God has constantly been seeking to woo his people back, to bring them into a relationship that could be restored, that they would be reconciled with one another. God gave them a covenant, with Abraham, that he would bless the nations through this nation of Israel that he was going to bring together, descendants of Abraham. And they would come and be blessed to all the nations of the world. And then when he spoke, excuse me, and then when he spoke to Moses, he gave Moses his covenant, right? To draw them near, to say, listen, I will be your God, you will be my people. And so what we find here in this text is that God is beginning to work this work in a way that is bringing and drawing people together. So friends, this text that we're looking at today is all about what that looks like, how we are all being brought together. And there are a number of themes. One of them you can see quite clearly, right, is this idea of spirit. Are we being spirit-led, or are we being worldly, right? The other side of this here is how should we look at at church leaders? Another theme. Let me read this to you now from verse 10 through 17. He says, "By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as an expert builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should be careful how he builds. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus, the Messiah. If any man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, his work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It's speaking about the coming judgment, right? What God says that what we're offering up to him is going to be tested to see its value, what it really was made of. He says it will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of each man's work. If what he has built survives, he will receive his reward. If what he has built is burned up, he will suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but only as one escaping through the flames. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple. So we go from this idea of being Spirit-led, or are we demonstrating, a pattern of behavior that is more worldly? And that then translates into, okay, well then, how are we to view God's servants within the church? What is God trying to build, right? As we just read here in verses 10 through 17. And then there is this theme about wisdom and what it really means to belong to Christ. Because look how this text ends. It says, do not deceive yourselves. If any of you thinks he is wise by the standards of this age, he should become a fool so that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. As it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. And the Lord knows that the thoughts of the wise are futile. So then, no more boasting about men. All things are yours, whether Paul, Apollos, Cephas, right? Cephas is Peter's, Hebrew name, right? Many times in the Gospels, it's Peter's. It'll say Cephas, and then it says, then give his name Peter. He says, so all things are yours, whether Paul, Apollos, Peter, or the world, or life or death, or the present or the future, all are yours. And you are of Christ, and Christ is of God. So this idea of wisdom and belonging, you do realize, here's another little tip sometimes about Bible studies. You see at the end of this passage, the reference again in verse 21, he says, so then, no more boasting about men. All things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, right? He's referring back to what he said to them in the very beginning of this chapter, when he says, you guys, he says, are you still, he says, you're still worldly. There's jealousy and quarreling among you. Are you not acting like mere men? One says, I follow Paul. Another, I follow Apollos. Are you not mere men? So in literature, they speak about like the two sides of a parenthesis. So this on the one hand, you get the mentioning here of this quarreling and this division. And at the end of this chapter, Paul is, wrapping up this subject because he's addressing it again. They call that like an inclusio, like in other words, everything is included. So this broad theme then about spiritual maturity, about divisions, about wisdom, all of this is a part of this text. And the reason why we're addressing that in this series now, Show and Tell, it's because if we're going to go out and bring, like Jesus says, we're supposed to go out into the world and let our light shine. so men would see our good work and glorify our Father who is in heaven. Then don't you see that we have to make sure that we're letting that light shine brightly? We're not taking that light and hiding it under a table. We're setting that light for all to see. So what is it that the church is really communicating to the world around them? I think this is a really interesting kind of text because it raises all kinds of issues for us, and I thought this would be a good way for us to spend this week together. So let me begin here by just giving you a little bit of a summary of what I think is going on here. So if you look now, right at this first 5 verses, let's talk a little bit about this idea of spiritual maturity and division. You notice that the contrast here is between those, he says, Paul is writing to them as Corinthians, which, by the way, the book of Corinthians, Paul is addressing all kinds of topics. It's Paul who had established this church, right? Now is writing to them because he's getting word that in some cases they've gone off the rails. He begins the book of First Corinthians calling them the church of God, which is a good thing, right? But they're not acting like the church of God. There are a number of things that are taking place within this church, not the least of which is that they're denying the resurrection, which is when you go to First Corinthians 15, you'll see, right? Or they have been abusing spiritual gifts, is what First Corinthians 13 is all about. Or you have the immorality of a man having his father's wife. Like that, when I read First Corinthians, I realize that the church, we have to work very hard at making certain that that we are walking in the spirit and we're not really caught up in the world that is around us. That it's something that is going to require us to make sure our focus is on doing the will of our Father in heaven. So when you look at this text and it begins and it says to you and me, Paul addresses the Corinthians and he says, you are acting like spiritual infants, right? You're not really living as spiritual. He says, I gave you milk, not solid food, for you and I for a couple of weeks. And it's a delight, but she's just starting to eat more and more regular food. But so you could see, like the diet, it has to correlate with her own development. And Paul is saying, listen, I want to give you more spiritual food, but you're not ready for it. And why are they not ready? He says point blank in verse 3, he says, because you are still worldly. Like, what does that mean? Well, in the context here, and context is very important because Paul is writing to a particular people for a particular purpose. So he's writing to these people who are demonstrating that there is some jealousy and quarreling that has taken place within the church. I don't know what some of your experiences have been, but I have been now working in the church since 1979. That's a long time, right? And in all those years, I have been parts of churches that I have seen been destroyed because people have taken sides over the silliest of things. It could be music. It could be, over the pastor. Like they some liked them, some didn't. He was, not sophisticated enough. He was too sophisticated. You know, I just think of transitions of churches, famous pulpits in our country, where it was really hard. I remember D. James Kennedy. pastored Coral Ridge Church. And when D. James Kennedy left that church, you have to imagine he left some pretty big shoes to fill. And they got Billy Graham's grandson to lead that church. And man, people came after that because he was not D. James Kennedy. Well, of course he's not D. James Kennedy. He doesn't have all the experience that D. James Kennedy had. Plus, those people had years and years and years of experience with D. James Kennedy. And it's not so easy for this young guy to come in and begin to take over. But what it did was it tore the church apart. And then the next thing you know, people were quarreling, and there was, taking sides. And this is what Paul is talking to them about. He's saying, listen, guys, you're a church that's just beginning to start, and you're already starting on the wrong foot. You're acting so worldly. And he calls them spiritual infants. And the divisions are what's showing that immaturity. See, this is what I want you to put together. That the reason why he's saying that they are spiritual infants is because they are demonstrating the attitudes here of jealousy and quarreling. And they're not ready for deeper spiritual truths. He calls it solid food. And here they are now just clinging, right? They're clinging to to this past. And Paul saying, listen, you should be doing much better than this. So now, when you read that text, would the idea of people taking sides like this, would you think that would rate on a list of things that would demonstrate a person is worldly or spiritual? You might just say, well, hey, this is just my opinion, right? This is how I feel about it. But what's happening in this context is that the church isn't moving forward. In fact, what the light that is being that they're shining in the communities around them is not very good. We see here that it's being diminished. Why? Because what people are seeing is this jealousy and quarreling, this taking sides, saying, hey, I'm of team Paul, or I'm of Apollos, right? Later on, he adds Peter to the mix, right? Like, come on, like, he is going to address how they should look at the leaders among them, and it's certainly not this way. And so this whole idea then of spiritual maturity and division, what are we to make of that? How are we, to really address that? And I think that is an important question to be had, especially in the days in which we are living. I've seen so many churches divide over the silliest of things. And there have been in ministries that I've been a part of, where I can see that someone liked this music better than the other, so they stop coming. And then the church and the community, it becomes a little diminished because it's not really leaning into everything that the Lord has for them, because they have already put up all kinds of barriers and encumbrances. People leave, because for just the silliest of reasons. And I think what really gets me is when you'll have people in the church who have been friends for years and years and years, and then over an issue like music or a version of the Bible, like I like King James and you like the New American Standard, and someone else likes the NIV, and next thing you know, they're getting into this huge fight. And they take sides, and the next thing you know, it creates such an atmosphere that people don't even want to come. I'm sure many of you who are listening here today, you have your own stories about how this works. But my point for you today is in this whole idea of maturity and division. Don't you realize that when we demonstrate this kind of attitude, Paul says we're mere infants. We're not ready for deeper spiritual truths. We're not ready for solid food. We're still acting worldly. That is something that needs to be addressed. And this whole passage is about to do that for us as we continue moving forward. And so I thought this would be great for us to be able to take a look at and begin to address some of these issues as we go along. So you think, how do we recognize spiritual maturity in your congregation? How are we to really take notice whether the church is truly being mature or still acting worldly? Well, look at the issues that they fight about. If the issue here is that God is saying to you and me that we are being called to love one another deeply from the heart, if the way in which we are demonstrating a generosity with people, with our time and our talents and our treasure, the way in which God's agenda and his word is being honored above all else, even if it means that sometimes his word is speaking so sharply into my life that I have to repent. Nothing wrong with repentance. It's a way of just making certain that I'm being trained, right? I'm being corrected. I'm being rebuked so that I might live this life that God has called me to. Nothing wrong with that. But just look at the nature of the fights that are taking place within the church and tell me, is that a sign of spiritual maturity, or is that a sign of worldliness? There could be all kinds of generational preferences, right? Worship styles, like I said, leadership, loyalty, and they can cause all kinds of division. It happens between the young and the old. The young come and they want to change things, and the older ones, they like it the way it was. And then instead of really fixing their eyes on what Jesus is calling us to, we wind up fighting with one another. You know, it was interesting. I had a conversation with someone just the other day about the golf course that they belong to. And on the golf course, they wanted to have more amenities. The course is really now just for golf, but they have enough land that they could put in a tennis courts or pickle courts and, expand some of the recreational activities. So other members of the family who don't play golf, they could also come and enjoy it, like a pool, things like that. And the diehards were like, no, this was created a golf course. We want it the way it is. And the younger ones are saying, yeah, but like my wife doesn't play or the kids are too young to play. It'd be nice for all of us to enjoy the club together. And I just smiled to myself because I thought, boy, isn't that the same way it is in a church? People will argue about all of these kinds of factors. Well, as you can see, this is going to be a fun week as we begin to dive in. Just to be clear, I have no agenda. I just want us to look at a text and see what God has to say for us as we move forward. It's always so that we would recognize that this revelation that we have in Jesus, it's worth seizing, and that we serve a God who is good all the time. God bless you, my friends, and thank you so much for joining me today on this Monday, the 18th. And Lord willing, we'll spend more time again next week. God bless.